that even the most, virulent of blasphemies cannot contaminate it. A space so sacred where even, uh, you know, I, a space so sacred, you may say, that even as, where even as one blasphemy sheepishly exits, another one may just discover itself on a pedestal sitting along with venerated truths. So that's the classroom for me. That's the classroom I've experienced as a teacher at LSR, as a student at LSR, and subsequent, universities, educational institutions. But this is not January 2020. And in the last 1.5 years, I have overseen 2 batches of students graduate the feminism class. And this experience has given me a new understanding of a safe space. So my idea of a safe space, the challenge of a safe space, first of all, it became a challenge, not just because you know, of teaching moving online, but also because, as I discovered, I was teaching feminism. One of the first things that this course made me conscious of, or rather made me see the visible, that is, that when we talk about safe spaces, we do so because there exist non-safe spaces. What and where are those non-safe spaces? Those were questions that we discussed, uh, in class, not directly, but I think those are questions which all of us were really answering without even asking that question. And more of that later if we have time. A hint of that binary, that is safe and unsafe spaces, a hint of that binary and the possibility of liminality in this is the use of the phrase inside/outside in the title of the monograph made by 4 of the students, Namika, Gayatri, Ishita, and Radhika, who'll be talking later. As the one leading the class, particularly with the second batch, one of my challenge was how to deal with what is actually a teacher's nightmare, a student bereft of curiosity. Yes, I did encounter disinterested students in the feminism course. And you can't blame them. In the age of hashtag MeToo, discussed ad nauseum in academic and popular literature and media, most are likely to think that we know all what there is to know about feminism. And if you happen to be a student at LSR, you do acquire the arrogance in your very first semester about this F word. And yes, it does become the F word. The irony or the paradox that I have come to witness is the social distancing young women students do from this F word. So, if at all I had in my class feminists, they were hesitant or reluctant feminists, that is, to begin with. I could divide them into 2 broad categories of hesitant feminists. One, those who want to be regarded as women and they fear that they lose that identity if they subscribe to feminism. Two, those who regard gender as being irrelevant and want to be treated as genderless, competent individuals, which basically means don't look at my sex, look at me objectively, look at my brains, look at my skills. And of course, the assumption that brain skills are all, not gendered. I dealt with this particular problem by engaging myself with the assumptions I made about students' frame of mind. So, to share, to share, with you what went into my, preparing for this course. Actually, I was very hesitant to teach this course, so I went back to my teacher, and she said that, okay, I think what you need to do really out here is to get into the student's frame of mind. And how do you do that? You do that by making students engage with their own assumption by asking them to reflect on questions such as those like, who is a feminist? And I have to thank Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath for this particular suggestion that she gave me, that this is the best way to make them actually, look forward to unpacking their own minds. So this served as a segue for the student to begin a conversation with herself. She was now at the center of things. The classroom became a context to experience a relationship with your own self. I think even the most critical of courses that I teach, political theory and now political philosophy, they do not provide us with that particular opportunity. That is a context to experience a relationship with yourself, to actually reflect on a relationship with yourself. And then there is the point about the introspective, inward looking, inside conversation making an outward turn. So, on one hand, what I had to ensure was to get the students look inward, uh, start that introspection, their own biases, prejudices, fears, uh, desires, and at the same time now also look outside, look at those around you, those outside, those whom you call your classmates. So before I discuss this, let me catalog a second challenge, which was how to obtain, or rather, yeah, attain a scientific objectivity in these experiential conversations, because this could not just be that here we are meeting in a cafe, and just chatting. It could not be a classroom just doing that. So the challenge was really that how do you now ensure that these experiential conversations have the hallmark of scholarship. So how do you steer it towards scholarship? It should not be bereft of scholarship, yet at the same time not reduce it to scholarship. Because this is a course that encourages questions and possibilities, structural transformations, and as I said, you are at the center of things. Here I went to the refrain of another teacher, the late Professor Randhir Singh, the Marxist, holding on to the Gandhian talisman and regularly asking and reminding himself and his students, how can what we do in our classrooms make a significant contribution to the lives of the poor? So, in the context of this feminism class, it was what we do in our classroom, what we read in our classroom, what we discuss in our classroom, how is that going to impact, change, transform, if there is a need to transform my life outside the classroom and those of other men and women. So, in the context of this class, we read the classics, but my lecture was always followed by a circle of reflections. Now, the circle of reflections, the idea of a circle process, is something that I learned as a student in the conflict transformation and peace building program, and the circle process has worked very well with those set of students. So this is something that I've never attempted in my political science classes, though being at LSR, those of you who are familiar with LSR would know that LSR is not a space for monologue lectures, but it is a dialogic space. So we've had questions and answers and comments from students, but I've never had a circle process in political science. And that circle process really made a difference. And what the circle process does is that it doesn't simply put an accent on speaking, it also puts an accent on listening. So, speaking, we all know that why feminism privileges um, speaking. So, let's say Gayatri Spivak, before she became a deconstructionist or whatever she did raise a feminist question in her seminal piece, Can the Subaltern Speak? So, can women speak? Will they be heard? So one of the things that we had to get around as a class was that those who were silent, who hardly ever spoke, were now compelled to speak. How do you ensure that they will speak? You had to ensure that they don't feel mocked at. And I must also say that, this particular emphasis that I put on speaking was also the reason why several students would, I think at times, feign that their internet is not working, or for reasons they can't unmute themselves. So speaking was definitely a challenge, but I think several came round to the fact that why speaking would be essential, because if you do not learn to speak, you will never be heard. If you do not, why speaking a political act? And then, but again, if the circle process had only focused on speaking, it wouldn't have meant much of a difference, I think, from a feminist lens. Because then what we are doing is that we as women are occupying, if we learn to speak, then what we are simply doing is we are becoming the new entrance into the masculinized spaces of speaking. So the only way to feminize that space of speaking is if it is accompanied by listening. So listening is not simply an intimately linked part to speaking, but like most intimate relationships, as Ashish Nandi would tell us, it can also be a victim of violence. That's where you encounter the greatest of violence. So the act of listening, as we know, is laborious. It may slow down your pace. It may make you retreat a few steps. It may compel you to change the course. And we do know that one of the challenges of our democracy the world over is to make our leaders listen. They speak. They're great orators. They speak. But is there any listening happening? So I think this is the feminist contribution to an enhanced understanding of leadership. So I did insist in my class that students switch on their cameras unless and until there was a compelling reason for them to not do so. And I think in this particular way, what we were also doing is, uh, I think, opening at one level the most intimate of our spaces, becoming comfortable with where we are, where we belong. And this itself, I think, was a great let's say icebreaker, that you could see each other, you could see that people are listening to you. Though I must say that given the short span of time, given the internet connectivity, I think a lot more could have been done with feminism, could have been done in these classes than did happen. And so there was also this lockdown fatigue, because of which students, I won't say were looking for a shortcut, but the pressures of now moving into another space, whether a university or a job. So you don't want to focus on that. You don't want to focus on class assignments. And after a point, all courses become that for you, assignments to be done, exams to be written. And so when the university offered them a choice that, there's only one assignment for you to do, most not actually all of them, backed out of the project that I was really looking forward to, which was, the monograph. And I don't know whether it was these, the four students who'll be talking to you now, what was it, whether they saw how crestfallen I was with that, how disappointed I was with that reaction, that they decided to take up that monograph. And so I, for example, didn't really know how to go about doing the monograph. It was supposed to be something that they were supposed, that they would do individually. On their own, it would be like a research paper. And at some point of time, it just didn't seem to be taking off. And that's when I had to, make an intervention, and I had to, force them to think. I mean, I had to force them to think, not necessarily think in a particular direction, because I do think that um, one of the challenges that we have in our times, not just out here in India, but I think the world over, is how do you participate in something enthusiastically if it is a teamwork, where people could be going in different directions. You may not get the credit for all. So for all that is done, how do you do that? So I think this is one of the reasons why most people decided not to be part of a collective effort. So these four young women, persisted with it, but I had to I mean, they'll talk about that experience, that we had to have several meetings online, and I think their enthusiasm enthused me. And there were times, there were occasions I really wished that I was one of them, in terms of their late night discussions about the monograph. And I think this is what learning is. I had a sense of deja vu thinking about my own experience, as an undergrad student, where we would, talk to friends for hours and hours, trying to, work out an assignment, how to do that. So I think it turned out to be a great experience, not just for them, but I think for myself too, in terms of, seeing what is it that we have done across these 4 months. We have used films in, the CTPB course, the conflict transformation course. We've done that in political science. Uh, we've, also used art. But here, talking about, things from a gendered perspective, did, uh, you know, lead to some interesting insights, where students actually brought photographs. One of the ideas that I gave is that think about your family, think about your friends, and if you can come up with any particular photograph of yourself, family, friends that you would like to share, and great reflections emerged out of it. And I think what really happened with this monograph is that it ceased to be, when I read it, when I look at what all has been done, and the effort these young women have taken to include the others in terms of their reflections. I see this as something which belongs to the entire class. And what I think the students probably are taking away from this, from what I can, make out, is that it's a discovery of similarities. That is the reflections that we had in class. I think the USP of this class was its reflections, uh, doing the readings, but now coming and seeing how relevant was that reading to the reality around. But we made sure we did those readings. So it's a discovery of similarities in the different experiences, both the pleasant and the unpleasant one. That's what happened when they were speaking in the circle process. It was about seeing shades of your own reflection in the other, and at times fascination with the difference in the other. And what different parts, I think for me, the most interesting part is that, what different parts they've all treaded so far, and how those parts converged at LSR. And now, the convergence of these several is going to lead into a dispersal into, a new several. And this particular class, particularly those who have not just written the monograph, but who have come to identify with the monograph, are going to like, it would be something like that there are these radiating rays, but the source, that there'll always be that source that they can go back to. I think those friendships and relationships have been made. And I have to thank these students for not reducing the monograph and the class discussions just to experiential narratives, because after all, we are talking about structures. We are so locating, embedding these experiences in structures, being conscious of that, I think has been the contribution of these students. So I thank them. Thank.
Thank you for that, Dr. Kashyap. You've set the context for the rest of the conversation this evening, I believe. You've developed the complexity of the classroom as a space, and you've highlighted how the classroom can have an impact on the world outside it and outside the university. And you've also foregrounded the importance of the community that came out of this classroom and the work done within this classroom. And I think that will inform our conversations going ahead. We turn now to Anjali Nayar. Anjali is an assistant professor at the United World Institute of Design at Karnavati University, Gujarat. She received her MS in journalism at the University of Columbia, before which she earned her BRes in film animation design at the National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad. She has written and illustrated children's books. She's widely published and has created video documentaries. She is also a recipient of the FUR Fellowship for Dalai Lama Studies this year. Anjali, we look to you to share with us your experiences of teaching animation design online and how this move online impacted classroom dynamics over the last few months.
Thank you so much, Meenakshi, for the introduction. And again, thank you to everyone for this opportunity to be present here and to share my experiences of teaching online for this past year. I'm just going to start sharing my presentation. Meenakshi, please let me know just in case it's not visible. Okay, so last year was my first foray into full-time teaching. And coincidentally, it was also when the pandemic was blowing. I have taught before as visiting faculty when I was invited by my previous professor at NID a couple of times. So I could compare, there was a vast difference between teaching in the studio and teaching online, and especially with courses like drawing and animation, storytelling. At first it felt as if it would be a big challenge, but of course me and the colleagues, we tried to figure out certain ways of going around and solving certain problems. And I figured that there were also while there were disadvantages, I figured also that there were certain advantages to the online mode. And I just want to quickly share a few stories, a few insights that I got from my last year's experience. So I was teaching in a visual communication school in Gandhinagar, and I started, as I said before, this was my first time teaching full-time. So this is a illustration by Jung, which I had kept on my desktop, so that because this image would help me remember to stay centered and to stay grounded and to tune into the real reason that I was drawn to teaching, and that's the love of my field, that's the love of animation, and also wanting to work with young people. So to be able to remember that, I would look at this image. A few of the courses which I was responsible for teaching last year were script writing, illustration, storyboarding. These are all processes for animation production mainly. Research for nonfiction animation and comic books. And then I was also guiding some student projects, final year projects. This is a little glimpse into my work, my previous work. So I also do non-feature journalism and research work alongside animation. My philosophy for teaching, one of my friends once asked, how do you how do you even teach something as abstract, as creative work, as animation and art? And my answer to that was, I don't. I consider my job as just creating the fertile soil in which they can come, have their own experiences, bring their own projects, and do their own learning, get their own learning. Because it seems apparent that young people are geared towards learning. They are, in a way, programmed towards learning. So I would try to find inspiring things for them to look at. I would try to start conversations. I would also, through the writing courses, invite students to look into their own lives and experiences. Because let's say, for example, something like the hero's journey, which script writing talks about, I felt that one of the best ways to look into that would be to look into their own lives and see where in their lives as children or as young people, they've overcome challenges or they've accomplished something. And as they see the growth in their character through those experiences, they may be able to translate that into their stories and their films. Just another reminder that came from Oogway from Kung Fu Panda, which is one of my favorite animation films, to believe in your students, to just believe, to trust that they can do a good job. And so I wanted to bring that trust in, I wanted to create that safe space. And this is how I started my journey last year. And okay, so now, usually, traditionally in animation, there are big setups, there's a big studio. So, but this is what our classroom actually looked like, which is quite different. As I was saying, that I felt that there were certain very interesting advantages to the pandemic. And again, I will share a couple of instances of those stories soon. This is another meeting where I was having with a student, where she was sharing her screenplay and her storyboard at the same time. And this is great because we were able to tune into each other's thoughts. She was in Bombay, I was here in Delhi, and she showed me a storyboard, she showed me a screenplay, so we had a discussion. So a lot of our meetings looked like this. This is another meeting where a student was sharing concept art for the way she wanted to take her film forward. Okay, so that was just a glimpse of how our meetings looked like. One interesting experiment that we did, and I don't think that had it not been for the pandemic, we would have thought about doing something like this. But basically, for an illustration course, me and my colleague decided to invite a ballet dancer from New York into our classroom digitally. And we had the students together, and we had a conversation with her. We saw her dance videos. We learned about her thought processes. We learned about her practice, her what she brings into the, what motivates her to dance. Basically, we learned about her life as a dancer, and the assignment was for students to translate all that as a poster. So in a sense, it was a direct client project, but with Elisa Toro Franchi, who's a ballet dancer in New York. And I think it was pretty cool because I don't think, frankly, we would have conceived of such a collaboration had it not been for the pandemic. These are a couple of explorations which the students did. She then shared some of these on her Instagram page. I quite enjoyed the process. So did the students. The pandemic got one student passionately thinking about the environment. It's something that she's cared about since she was young. But the pandemic sparked off this curiosity into, can I do something? Can I spread some awareness? She started thinking like that, and she wanted to make some posters. This was not a classroom assignment. She did this as a side project. So here she's done these two projects for the environment. One, you can see the iceberg. She's trying to say that what we see as the problem is just the tip of the iceberg. And in the other poster, these bears have woken up before winter ended because it got warm, and now they don't have any food to eat. So again, and she's developing these posters even further. She's coming up with more ideas and writing articles about this. This was a student project for as I was telling before, one of those assignments where students were encouraged to look into their own lives, to find stories from their own lives. I'll call her Shreya because she didn't want to be public about her name, but here. She came with this story about having encountered her fake persona. She felt that she has lived her entire life trying to please her parents, trying to please her school, being a dancer, being a sports person, doing well in school. But in that process, she hasn't figured out who she is. So again, I personally felt that had she been in a classroom with 40 other students in a university with a lot of other entropy, I'm not sure if she would have encountered this story, or maybe yes. And it's also very hard to know this. It's just an assumption from my side. But being alone, living at home again after having spent 1 year in college, she encountered this concept of this fake persona, and she shared a story, but she was a little pessimistic about it. She felt that she felt she can't overcome this. This was the way she had written the story in the first draft, like, I've always been like this, I don't think I can overcome it. But as I listened to her story, I was able to see it from an objective perspective. I was also her guide for the project. I could see that no, she has taken the first step to acknowledge that she is living with this persona. So I was like, I told her, I don't think you are a helpless victim anymore, because you are able to acknowledge this. So it seems as if you have taken the first step. So in a way, you have started the hero's journey. It's beginning for you. And I invited her to think about what I had said. She went back and she worked on this for 2 or 3 weeks, and came back with this beautiful comic book. I'm sharing a few pages. Here she's troubled. She's not able to sleep, facing insomnia. And in her dreams, she sees these walls crumbling. Everything she knows is breaking apart around her. Which is basically her world falling apart, as she feels that she's, breaking the persona, but she doesn't have any foundation yet to stand on that. But the last page, so her persona is taunting her, you'll never break free of me. And the last panel, she says, no, I'm not. So I feel like that's when she wakes up to her power. And I found that this was really, really powerful. Again, like, it's not objectively possible to really say, could the story have happened if it weren't for the pandemic? But I just feel like, because she was all living alone in her house, spending so much time in her room, one does face one's shadows at that point, right? So perhaps, just an idea. Another student, Nirvan, he had an encounter in a way with his inner critic, with his critical voice. He came back with the comic book about how he's haunted by these demons, feeling insufficient, feeling insecure, how he tends to fall into the darkness of the inner voice of not the inner voice, sorry, the critical voice. And this was for a research course, and I had encouraged students to think about what are the questions which have been haunting them lately. And he came back with this one. He was saying that I've been constantly fighting with a sense of despair about my work, who I am, everything. And so he delved into the inner critic. He researched, he looked into other artists who have often faced these fears and these feelings of inadequacy. He read some psychology about it, and he came up with a comic book where he started with sharing his own experience, saying, when I was a little child, I used to love drawing, but now I can't. Now it's suffering for me. And again, it's an experience which a lot of people have. I think when we turn our passion into work, which we're trying to sell, it can happen that some amount of despair can become a part of the process. And again, it was a learning experience for me as a teacher also, because a lot of students face this, and when things stop being play and pleasure and bliss, and they start wanting and then you start applying rules to it. What is the best way to compose something? How do you color theory, this, that? So people can tend to feel overwhelmed by that. Another thing about this, again, this is an image of his demons, and he also dived a little bit into his childhood and where did these demons come from. Yeah, another thing about going to university, I feel, to learn art or to learn creative writing, one thing I think everyone has to be a little bit careful about is that people may want to imitate what is in fashion at that moment, losing touch with their own inner voice, with their own unique expression. So I wanted my students to be able to stay in touch with their need for telling a story, what brings them to tell stories, what is their unique style, what is their unique voice, and not get so distracted by others. Yes, a lot of artists will imitate and then find their own voice, but I think that, like, even in NIDs, I saw this, and when everyone was together in the studio, a lot of similar work was happening. But I've also noticed that these students were able to stay true to their styles through the year and develop their styles further rather than doing imitations of each other, which I again feel could be a positive benefit of the pandemic. Okay, so talking about a few personal challenges, sometimes students would not turn on the camera, and I never enforced it. Our university had taken a call not to enforce it because they felt that different people come from different backgrounds and economic backgrounds, and they, one can understand why sometimes students will not want to turn on their cameras. But personally, as a teacher, I was feeling like the more I saw someone on camera, the more.
Interrupt, just a minute or so to go.
Okay, thank you. Almost done. So here, so one of the things which was happening for me was that I was probably getting biased towards the students who were always on camera versus the ones who hardly showed themselves, even though they came and met me in personal meetings. But somehow, I don't know whether it's the human mind, but it's harder to remember the ones that are not on camera. It's harder to. It was even harder to interact with them, and the reticent students, the introverted students who would not come on camera so much. So it was a bit of a struggle for me to make sure, to try that I would not get biased, but it was happening, so that was one. And this was the last day with one of my courses. This was one really sweet gesture. The student baked a cake for me, and I really wanted to taste it, obviously, but then it was also beautiful to see it. I thought it was a beautiful gesture. So I feel like we were all trying to do our best and make it feel as if we were still together in a live classroom, trying to overcome the challenges of the online model. Yeah, that's it. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Anjali. You've shown us how you centered and foregrounded things like trust and care and self-reflection in the classroom as ways to deal with something that's so transformative and perhaps even traumatic as moving online and not being around one another. And it's interesting that you highlight how you were able to have global collaborations and how you think that perhaps working alone added to your students' skill and their work. So thank you for sharing that. Next, we move to Diksha Podar. Diksha is associated with Wiscomp as a consultant, and she has been administering Login Gender since its inception. She is currently pursuing her doctoral research at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She's studying the processes of narrativization around youth and peace building in conflict areas. Before earning her MPhil in South Asian Studies, Diksha completed her Master's in Development Studies from Ambedkar University, Delhi, and received her undergraduate degree in Political Science and Economics from Lady Shri Ram College for Women, University of Delhi. Diksha, we hope to hear from you about your experiences as a social science research scholar whose work draws from interviews and field work. What was your experience of the field online, and how did this shift affect your relationship with your supervisor and your cohort over the last year?
Thank you, Meenakshi. Hello, everyone. Furthering Dr. Kashyap's presentation and Anjali's reflections, I'd like to bring on the table my experiences as a young social science researcher studying conflict and peace within the discipline of international relations. The virtual university has affected every facet of the teaching, learning, researching experience. Today, I share my experiences of working around three of the most critical aspects of social science research: the field, resources, and mentorship. With ethnographic research, especially in the areas of conflict, one's interactions with and in the field are very critical, I feel. My research focuses on youth, their behaviors, their motivations, their everyday lives, their relationships, their methods of negotiating the conflict, their transformative experiences of using creative arts. To put it simply, it is about studying their lives in their context. The pandemic and the sudden shift to virtual methods have deeply impacted the way I interact with my respondents and my field. Due to the lockdowns and working remotely, there aren't many things that I can observe, as my access to their context is now limited through their Zoom screens. A lot has been left to my own imagination, instinct, and understanding to fill these gaps. These new ways have also pushed me to completely reframe my methodological framework and revisit my questionnaires to engage in a meaningful conversation online. For instance, I had to be more creative in seeking responses to specific questions. I pushed myself to develop an exercise to be conducted virtually to hold on to my respondents' attention and concentration in these 3-hour-long Zoom conversations. And trust me, there hasn't yet been any literature to refer to as to how to do ethnic research and research methodologies for studies that are conducted online. It all has been the hidden trial method. Some things worked, some things didn't, and some things worked very differently. However, surprisingly, these online platforms have also proven themselves very helpful in many ways, such as recording these online interviews have provided me space to revisit the conversations, expressions, the undertones over and over again. And with this, note-taking is an easier job now than before. And I could concentrate more on the interview and the conversation. Also, my respondents could make time for my research more easily. For instance, one of my respondents is a mother to 5-year-old twins and had requested to give the interview only after the kids have slept. And we had our interview through Zoom from 11:30 p.m. at night to 3 a.m. in the morning. With this, I feel virtual spaces have provided a great deal of flexibility to make time amongst multiple responsibilities at home and at work. Access to resources has been a big question for me. Libraries across the cities were shut down. Not all resources are available free of cost or at cheaper rates for students to access. And as a student, access to resources has been a major challenge throughout. I relied mostly on sources of information that could be accessed online, both through open sources as well as those provided by the university. However, I must bring here that my university did make a provision for us to access library remotely. We could send our list of requested books to the librarian, and later on a specified date, we could collect them from the university. And this has been quite helpful. But most of my friends who had booked the hostels and had moved to their home cities in different parts of the countries, I wonder, how are they supposed to make use of such service extended by the university? Moreover, I must admit that the restricted global travel has been helpful for young researchers like me in a way that we have been able to access international conferences, experts, and resources more easily. Now I have a much larger pool of talks, conferences, and webinars to choose from and see what aligns with my interest of research interest areas. Further, supervisors' regular guidance is an integral aspect of any doctoral research, and pandemic has affected this in many ways. The inability to meet my supervisor to discuss my progress, readings, roadblocks, next steps has shifted a lot more responsibility on me to track and mitigate through these. We were mostly reduced to just telephonic conversations or Zoom calls, which, as we all know by now, that cannot be replaced for in-person discussions, especially when you are seeking guidance. Spaces to interact with my batchmates, peers, and friends have also reduced considerably, thus shrinking spaces for peer-to-peer learning and exchange of ideas that I feel are, again, very critical for any research. To what I began for my PhD has panned out very differently as I approach its conclusion. I'm not sure if it's good or bad, but what I'm sure that it has been a process of finding newer methods, newer directions, and newer meanings in the context of the pandemic, university shutdowns, remote learning, uncertainties, and the health factor, with an intent to make it more relevant for the present times. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Deeksha. You've taken us through a complete journey of the changes you've had to make, both positive and more challenging. It's particularly interesting that you talk about how, even though a lot of us feel as though it's blurred the lines between home and work, you do highlight how somewhere for your work, you're able to get more work done around people's schedules because you work with other people and their very specific schedules. So that was something very interesting to learn about. Next, we move to Ayushi Gupta and Rashi Anand, who are both PhD candidates at the International Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology and are both members of the Plant Biology Insect Resistance Research Group. Ayushi earned her bachelor's degree from Gargi College, University of Delhi, and her master's from the University of Delhi as well. Her research primarily focuses on understanding the molecular mechanisms underlying rapid adaptive nature of insect pests. Rashi too received her bachelor's degree in botany from Gargi College, University of Delhi, and earned her postgraduate degree at the TERI School of Advanced Studies with a specialization in plant biotechnology. Her research work primarily focuses on two major pests of rice and its interaction with its hosts. Rashi and Ayushi, we look to you to talk about the impact moving online may have had on your lab work and the functioning of your research team and other collaborative work during the pandemic.
Thank you, Meenakshi. Thank you for the introduction. Well, to begin with, let me just put it this way. The kind of background we have is entirely different from what we are hearing in this discussion. No social science, no literature. It's pure sciences and lab work and bench work. Well, just to put it together, we'll just share our experiences that we've had in the past 2 years. So like last year, with the pandemic and the lockdown and all that scenario, we weren't able to go to the lab at least for about 45 days to 60 days, like 2 months. And being in the plant insect interaction group, we've got insect cultures and we have to maintain them. Our insect has a lifespan of about 21 to 25 days. So we had to ensure that, there's somebody looking after them. We're giving them food, water, and everything. So that's a weekly routine that we have, and somebody had to take care of that. So thankfully, our supervisor had been kind and generous enough to take trips to the lab during that time because we weren't even permitted during that time. But we managed to get special letters and stuff. So being a Delhiite, I don't live very far from my workplace, so I could travel to and fro. So that was very difficult, but sometimes I used to feel it was good because I was like probably the only person in the lab. Nobody used to be there on the entire floor. I had everything to myself and I could work very, very peacefully and quietly there. But coming onto the online version and how we had to manage, so the period where we couldn't do, we were basically just reading and catching up on the literature. But I know about one of my colleague who faced a lot of issues because of this. So she was like, we both, me and Ayushi, are in our third, fourth year of PhD. But that colleague that I'm talking about, she was on the verge of finishing her work. So she had written a thesis. Now, when you're writing a thesis, you need that, to fro with the supervisor, that constant correction and everything. Now, because of the lockdown, she had to move back to her hometown in Kashmir. And there we know what the internet connection and issues are like. So it was very difficult for her. And in fact, because of that reason, her entire submission process got delayed at least about 7 to 8 months. So it's not that everybody is easily accessible and, everybody has access to internet, and that ease that we guys have here, that's not for everybody. Apart from that, there was nothing major that we missed out on, because since we were working regularly in this lockdown, also for about a month, I had to skip, but then we were back on track. So there wasn't much of online discussions or anything, but yeah, with supervisor, we had to be in touch and, you had to update them. And so, but it wasn't much of a trouble for us because, there wasn't much missing out. Apart from that, there was one thing that I remember from last year's experience. So there are some basic techniques and experiments that we plan, and you need your resources well sorted before you start. So there's for I don't know whether I should use these technical terms also or not. So we set up an experiment, and you need that oligos. Let me just put it like that. We need something called oligos to start our experiment. So I had planned everything. We didn't know such a thing would happen, and we had ordered our stuff, but our resources just couldn't get delivered. And because of that, 2 months, 3 months, everything just got delayed. So it's just one experience that I'm sharing that such a thing happened. But thankfully, it wasn't such a big trouble for us, and we could manage our way out through this pandemic. Yeah, rest I'll leave it to Ayushi to share her experience as well.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, ISKCOM, for inviting us to this online discussion. As Rashi rightly said, for us who work in the field of plant-insect interaction, the majority of research is conducted through wet lab experiments that need physical presence at the university. There is no way you can do it online. I mean, online is no substitute for bench work, but due to pandemic, the lab work came to a halt. Like, we had limited access to resources, library, etc. Besides, we work on insects, and we have active insect cultures growing in the lab. And maintaining those cultures during the lockdown was really a challenge. But thanks to our supervisor, who despite the lockdown somehow managed to keep them alive. Then for us, even after the lockdown is lifted, it took time to gradually resume the lab work. First of all, the thing is, we rely on many consumables and reagents. Like Rashi told about oligos, we need many consumables and many such reagents which needs to be imported from abroad. And this process normally takes a few weeks' time. But during these times, it may take even months. Sometimes it will be stuck in customs. Then even after it's cleared from customs, there'll be no one to deliver. So these were some of the issues which we faced. Secondly, I believe the current world situation has affected everybody, but it has severely affected PhD scholars who have just finished or they are near submission. Like with universities shut or operating with just 50% staff, the submission process was delayed. Now there are lesser opportunities, funding, like sometimes even if you have an offer, you're stuck because of travel restrictions. So I think for people who have just finished, it is really, really difficult. But for people like me and Rashi, who are in the process of finishing their degrees, we could not go to the lab due to the ongoing lockdown. And as a consequence, our work suffered. And for many, I believe it will certainly take more time to finish our degrees, and that too without any fellowship. But speaking of myself, I tried to utilize my time the best way I could, thanks to internet and these online platforms where we could communicate. So the level of communication with my supervisor was not changed. I mean, I devoted my time to analysis, data analysis, reading and writing, which is very difficult when you are doing bench work. So to be on the positive side, it helped me to devote more of my time to reading and writing. And of course, now we are connected. We have e-conferences, and all these webinars have become a new format for scientific meetings. And there are means now to be connected with your colleagues, and you can use there are a wide range of video conferencing and teleconferencing platforms, and they are really helpful. But there is like all these things cannot substitute in-person meetings. Like we were unable to conduct experiments, and Zoom meetings are no substitute for that spontaneous interaction that spark new ideas. Sometimes when you look at results and you have somebody to discuss, it becomes very easy. Sometimes many ideas come in. So I guess online, as far as it remains a choice, it is good. But when it becomes an obligation and the only option available, it is difficult. So for me, it was like kind of a mixed experience. And I think it was same for Rashi as well. So thank you very much for this thing.
Thank you, Rashi and Ayushi, for explaining your work to us so lucidly. This, as you note, is not an audience that's very familiar with the kind of research you do, but it's really striking to me, at least, that not only did you have to focus on making it through the pandemic yourself, but also quite literally to keep your research alive. And it's interesting that you highlight that online is fine as long as it's a choice that you can add to your current university experience. But when it becomes the only option, it is something that's difficult to move into. Thank you for sharing. Now we move to Iram. Iram earned her master's degree in comparative literature from the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London, and in English literature from the University of Karachi. Iram's research interests lie in the areas of South Asian literature, feminist literature, and the intersections of religion and literature. She is currently preparing for her doctoral studies and began her teaching career recently at Greenwich University in Karachi. Iram, we are hoping to hear from you about your experience of transitioning from being a student and research scholar to being an educator, all online and during the pandemic, and even across continents. And of course, what did moving online during your MA mean for you and your work?
Thank you, Meenakshi. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here today. It is really a privilege, and I've been really enjoying and taking notes from all the different talks that we have had so far. And I hope to add something productive and new to these conversations. So let me start by saying a few words about the different roles that I've transitioned between over the last year. So during the first trimester of the UK lockdown, I was in my third semester of the university working on my dissertation. I only had a few classes left over from term 2, and therefore only a few times I had to bear with online classes. So until September, I was reading for and writing my dissertation, or in all honesty, on most days, simply trying to do those things. I then started my home-based internship, during which I was given new tasks the first day of every week. And then the rest of the week would be me and my desktop sharing a mutual hatred and barely meeting the deadline at the end of the week. My teaching role didn't start until March, by which time I had returned to Pakistan and was living with my family. All classes were held online, and only recently the term has concluded. I'm going to be teaching at a different place September onwards, but I can reasonably expect the coming semester to unfold entirely in the digital space. Transitions, whether from university to office or internship to a full-time job, are usually accompanied by a mix of anxiety and exhilaration, of meeting new people, learning about the culture of a new place, putting in extra hard work at the start to set yourself up for success, however you define it. My transition from being a student to being an intern didn't actually feel that different materially. Both involved waking up early, followed by a swift dispelling of accumulated blues from the previous day, and then an endless cycle of charging my laptop, adjusting brightness level to suit long hours of reading and working, and then breaking from work thrice a day only for meals. I think that often what helps us to adapt to a new environment or square with big transitions in life is the fact of territorial separation, which was missing in my case. So my mind at the time, which was twice as industrious as my body, would be round the clock exhausted. Parks were the only recreational spots still accessible in the UK, and therefore walks became my constant. And although walks could not replace the culture of cafes that provided both, productivity and some entertainment and relaxation, um, they were still quite useful. Now, many of my friends had to leave the UK, and I chose to stay behind during the lockdown for several reasons. But what had eased the decision for me to stay back in the UK and not go home when I had the chance was this naively optimistic assumption that the study spaces like SOAS and British libraries would remain open, and that the lockdown would last at max 2 months. These spaces were the last to take the hit, but they did nonetheless. And that's when the worry really set in for me. Many of the resources were available online, but working with dated texts and archival materials became difficult, due to which I had to change from my original research topic. Meetings with supervisor, although extremely helpful, felt distant and incomplete and impersonal. I also resumed my therapy sessions, which were a terrible fail online, because body language and gestures and all those little things that humanize the therapist-patient relationship were no longer there. And I was realizing it just now when the lockdown had already happened. It was, like many of you pointed out on the discussion forum, an isolating experience, especially because there was hardly a better news around. I saw my friends leaving, and the worst of news setting in the spaces they had vacated in my life. With increased screen time, there was little motivation to continue to read or listen on the phone after long hours of working, and so remote connection with friends didn't appear viable. The internship didn't require any impossible resource access, but it was wanting in vibrancy and excitement that comes with adjusting to a new work environment. It felt like another supervisor tasking me with things until our next meeting, company of colleagues, joy of a distracted, haphazard work routine, informal learning in cafeterias were irreparable losses. My shift to the teaching job brought about anxieties I hadn't experienced in the UK, which included unstable internet connectivity, irregular electricity supply, and inconsistent room lighting, as you can see. But my students had far more to deal with. They had multiple classes in a day, lengthy exams that drained their eyes and body, and many of them joined in from shared or public spaces of home. Sometimes family matters took precedence and they would get a call from one of their parents and they would have to leave the class. The introverted ones often hesitated to participate and chose to be represented by their screen names. I remember this one time when I had planned a 10-minute quiz, which, due to my digital deficiency, inexperience, and unpredictable technical difficulties, took up an hour and a half to complete. Experiments seldom succeeded, and Q&A sessions were often marred by time lags and half-accurate readings of the speaker's comment or question. After a whole term, I still know fairly little about the university and its culture. I was on the campus only twice, and both times on brief business. It was quite far away from my home, and it felt futile to visit when neither my colleagues nor my students were there. It seems strange still that whom I call mentors and peers now are people I've never met or met only once. But there are benefits to establishing relationships virtually. The ritual is no longer meeting, but calling or texting, and that has the potential to get any relationship through geographical and temporal changes. In addition, for introverted students like myself and some of those I taught at Greenwich, sometimes giving presentations online felt less anxiety-provoking. While some students worry that their message will be bodily and gesturally unsupported and therefore liable to be misinterpreted in the virtual classroom, others rejoice at the prospect of participating without having to deal with the direct judgmental gaze on them. The collective need to seek some semblance of normalcy as well as learning opportunities online enabled a rapid shift to a culture of webinars, virtual lectures, remote viewings, etc. And it was a welcome change for many, including myself, during lockdown. It continues to be a means of learning for me, an urban citizen of Pakistan with good internet to make up for being financially unequipped to undertake travel for top-notch learning opportunities. While students in other parts of Pakistan have unfortunately suffered massively as the system moved online, I do think that the pressure it has put on the provincial and federal governments to facilitate electricity and internet accessibility has been unprecedented. It was about time that we engaged in innovation. The lockdown learning also made me more self-reliant. Most of the times I wrongly assumed that I was all alone in this. But in fact, being on my own helped me in some ways. Not out of design, but I did learn some time and focus management tools that have helped me ever since. I've also accidentally, but fortunately, ended up with a community that knows and empathizes with my needs. I remember how once an acquaintance, someone with whom I was barely on greeting terms with, messaged me out of the blue and proposed that we do our individual work on a muted video call. It was a curious but well-meaning replication of the kind of collaborative work routines we each had before the lockdown. Moreover, I have learned a great deal from my students at Greenwich University, who, despite the many challenges they have faced since the onset of online classes, have continued to keep up their energy around each other. I feel inspired seeing them strongly hold on to the joy they derive from studying literature in the face of chaos and uncertainty. They have maintained their humor, and that is really the most one can ask for in times like ours. As far as my individual journey is concerned, undertaking massive transitions during COVID has meant, on a more positive note, more time and felt urgency of reevaluating my direction in career and life. Yes, just a minute, just 1 minute. Diksha, thank you. Thank you for the reminder. I've recurrently thought about what it is that keeps me motivated in any job and whether it's okay for the motivation to be heavily dependent on factors like environment, colleagues, monetary benefits, etc. I've asked myself whether my ideas of productivity and efficiency have so far been misinformed and my attention to community and support building less inadequate. In other words, some significant realignment and readjustment has also resulted from this period. In addition, I have wondered what I might do from the comfort of my home for those in my ambit who have been affected by the pandemic far worse than me. As a teacher, I attempted to create a classroom environment where my students and I are equally comfortable so that no one is saddled with burdens of demands on top of the existing grueling struggles. I listened to their concerns and did my best to either address them myself or bring them to the attention of the relevant authorities. I designed and executed the assessments in a way so as to minimize clashes in deadlines and optimizing opportunities for earning a good grade. These, I believe, are practices that should be in place with or without COVID, and I hope they'll be a part of the post-COVID world. Lastly, as a student turned academic who has been unbelievably lucky with job procurement, what behoves me now is to honestly take stock of my needs and privileges. If, as a teacher, I exercise certain power, I should be mindful of facilitating my students to the best of my potential. I believe I should also remember my student life experiences and take them into account while taking crucial decisions for my students. Most importantly, though, if it has so happened that I'm spending more time interacting with students rather than in the staff room with my colleagues, I should be willing to expand my imagination with regards to what a community means to me. So that was all from me. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for the edit time as well.
Thank you so much, Iram, for speaking on the one hand of how isolating your initial lockdown experience and research experience must have been, for talking about the fraught and tense nature of classrooms that involve so many personal, professional, and familial considerations coming together to form an online classroom. And thank you also for sharing your commitment to the community of your classrooms as you progress in your career as a teacher. Before we move on to the next section, I'd like to invite those of you who have questions to leave them in the chat box. We'll try to get to them at the end of the next section of this evening. When Dr. Kashyap began her opening remarks, she spoke about her class on feminist theory, where she encouraged students to reflect on themselves and develop relationships with themselves. Through this, she spoke about the monograph that some of her students came up with and worked on committedly over the last semester. We have 4 of those students with us: Anamika, Gayatri, Ishita, and Radhika, all 4 of whom earned their BAs in political science from the department at Lady Shri Ram College for Women, University of Delhi. Anamika, Gayatri, Ishita, Radhika, we are excited to learn about your experience of completing your undergraduate degree online, your experience of the sociality of college during the pandemic, and of course your experience of on working collaboratively towards this monograph.
Thank you, Meenakshi, and thank you to WISPCOM for giving us the opportunity to talk about this little project. On the 7th of March in 2020, we returned from our college for our midterm break. And had I known that that was going to be my last day in college, I would have never returned home. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in the closure of all educational institutions. Our academic calendars were torn apart as we were suddenly plucked away from the traditional education system and thrusted into a full-fledged online classroom. As students, this meant that not only were our classroom spaces shifted online, but our entire university and its campus existed merely on WhatsApp, Google Meet, and Zoom. On such an online campus, it became exhausting to maintain the old group of large number of friends. As a result, most of our social circles diminished. Since we no longer bumped into one another at random corridors, the opportunity to have spontaneous conversations became restricted. Texts, calls, and the occasional video call were most often planned and took place according to each other's needs and schedules, as a result of which the nature of the conversation that we had with one another also changed. College communities were the space in which we could make new friends. Formal societies such as the Dramatic Society, the Books and Documentaries Review Club, or the Dance Society, etc., no longer held active meetings and events as they did in college. One reason was that most of these activities required real-life interactions, which was not possible to replicate over a Google Meet. Another reason was that many students did not have enough data, time, or even energy to attend such events after extensive online classes. Another space where one could make new friends was the classroom. For instance, in our final year, we had the opportunity to interact with students from the other section. But it was difficult to form natural friendships with friends from the other section merely because our interaction was again limited to the classroom. Similarly, it was also difficult to form connections with new professors who hadn't taught us in previous semesters. Initially, I thought that the lockdown would allow me to attend classes from the comfort of my bedroom. But learning from home was much harder than I thought. Participation was limited because people took time to adapt to the new classroom. Thereafter emerged the issues of connectivity, limited data packs that restricted the ability to attend online classes. But one of the most important issues faced by students, especially women students in particular, was the blurring of the public and the private space. When classrooms shifted online, there was no physical space that was separate from home, which we could attend as college. Students would often have to share their room with their siblings, or as in my case, with my grandmother. We often had to assist our mother with household chores. In an online classroom, each of us became very hyper aware of our personal circumstances, and we were forced to reflect on the same. And these differences became not obvious just to us, but to anyone else who stared into our screen. Thus, most of us switched off our cameras. In such an online classroom, it was far more easier to zone out than in an offline classroom. As a result, the process of learning became largely self-motivated. Throughout last year, I would constantly expect that college would reopen the next month, and in the following month, I would postpone my expectation. But ultimately, last week, as I graduated on Google Meet, my expectations about my entire college experience had to be reworked. During this pandemic, the entire student community was facing very similar challenges, and yet each of us experienced these in such an individual manner that it made the online classroom a very alienating space. In this context, I think Radhika would offer a brighter perspective on one of the few interactive classes that we had in college.
Thank you, Gayatri. After having a general overview of the online college experience in the pandemic, we would now like to focus on the experience of a specific class, that is of feminism. In the name of the course which we studied is Feminism in Theory and Practice. It is imperative for us to discuss the experience of our feminism class because of its distinct pedagogy, which inspired us to document it in the form of our monograph. What set this class apart from other classes was the pedagogy which we followed, where we tried to adapt Bell Hooks' Engage pedagogy. This method of teaching learning is focused on the active participation of learners along with the teachers. Agreeing with Bell Hooks, I believe education should be a practice of freedom, where we develop critical awareness and engagement. This class helped us to develop the lens of criticality and reflexivity in the issues which seem trivial or uncritical. For example, seeing how gender roles and forces of gender socialization have power over us in our homes, workplaces, and daily lives. The feminist epistemology and methodology insist on the validity of experience as a way of understanding political reality. Hence, the experience and personal narratives of the students were given primacy. In the absence of objective accounts by women, resources like experience become valid and necessary. The validity of these experiences is further attested by the fact that, as scholars of feminism, we subject these experiences to critical reflections, and these reflections are derived from rationality, which add a degree of objectivity to them. The subject matter of feminism was discussed in close relation to our personal experiences and narratives, or rather, our personal experiences were examined from the lens of gender. Unlike other classes, students were not expected to separate the element of personal from the public sphere of the classroom. Hence, the nature of our engagement with the subject was very personal, and being in an all-women space made the class more comfortable as the pressure to perform our gender was minimal. Class discussions, presentations, collective activities like movie screenings, photo discussions, maintaining and sharing journals, sharing personal stories, etc., made classes less alienating as these conversations were continued beyond the classes. The nature of engagement with the subject and the class activities helped the students to form a safe space which facilitated the learning process in times where curiosity and engagement have taken a backseat. Although the experience of these classes was not homogeneous and it had its own limitations. Firstly, not everyone had the infrastructure, resources, or family support to attend these classes in a peaceful atmosphere. Here, curiosity too is a privilege. Secondly, students being subjects of critical inquiry in class were many a times left unsettled, as at the end of the day we all had to go back to our daily lives where patriarchal forces would exert pressure on us. Now I will hand over the floor to Anamika.
Thank you, Radhika. The monograph, which we have titled as Feminist Windows Looking Inside Outside the Classroom, was envisioned as a class assignment where each student had to engage with a question, concern, or an issue of feminism. But due to several constraints imposed by the pandemic and other reasons that remain unknown to us, only 4 of us volunteered for this project. So we decided to archive the classroom as experienced by the 4 of us as individuals and the entire class as a group. What we began with is very different from the final product that we have now. Almost 4 months of working together, the creation of the monograph was in itself a journey. In the beginning, our only task was to compile what we had discussed in the class that we thought was of value and required further reflection. Later on, however, encouraged by our professor, we began to document our experience as well. This experiential focus of the monograph meant that we had to engage with issues of online education and pandemic, which also had an impact on how we experience the feminism class as well. For some of us, the monograph acted as a further motivation to pay attention in class as we were supposed to reflect on what we studied. This encouraged us to engage even more with what we were reading and the discussions that were taking place in the class. The monograph also turned into a bonding exercise for the four of us. The sense of community that we felt with the rest of the class was in part a result of working so closely with each other on this project. We were able to connect and form new bonds as we went through this entire process. By the end of it, half an hour before each meeting was devoted to catching up with each other and sharing personal stories. Usually, these meetings used to take place late at night as our routines and schedules had changed drastically, and some of us had domestic chores that had to be done. These late night long calls sometimes made us wonder whether such a collaborative work would have been possible in an offline setting. Personally, for me, the answer is probably no. But it was not a smooth sail as it might seem. There were moments of doubt, frustration, and defeat as we struggled to finish this project while dealing with the pandemic and online classes as well. As we learned to adapt with this online mode of learning and living, the second wave disturbed our sense of normalcy again that we had created for ourselves. It was a reminder of the temporary nature of this new normal that we had created for ourselves. While we dealt with and witnessed death and sickness in our own personal lives, the monograph became a source of joy, and it also provided us with a sense of purpose even when we felt helpless. Each of the members of this team has helped each other during these tough times in their own ways. To be able to create something during this pandemic which required us to actively think and use our creativity was a difficult but a fulfilling task. Even when we faced challenges that slowed down our progress, we never stopped believing that our work was important. It was not only important because we were archiving our feminism class, but also because of the context in which the class was taking place, where public-private dichotomy was blurred, and in a world where solidarity had once again become important. Now I would like to hand over to Ishita.
Thank you, Anamika. These experiences of online education in a pandemic and reflecting upon them in the context of our feminism class shaped our ideas of what the student is, what the classroom is, and how they should be. The student, it became increasingly clear, was shaped in so many ways by her context and social location. The mediation of variables like caste, class, gender influenced the availability of material and non-material resources available to her, which further impacted not only her ability to learn, but also at times the willingness to learn and the nature of engagement that one has with her subject. It is not that differences or inequalities did not exist before, but the pandemic and the digital divide made them increasingly visible and made us all extremely aware of them. The need, therefore, to be sensitive and empathetic in and outside class became very clear to us. Coming to the classroom, as it was displaced from a physical to a virtual setting, one realized foremost the need and importance of communities in learning. The online pandemic combined meant that our interactions with our classmates, our teachers were limited, were infrequent, even though the need for comfort, for mutual care, for support had increased. Communities, therefore, served not only as sites of support, but also a place wherein we could come together and help each other make sense of the circumstances that we were all in. They were important for assisting each other as fellow learners, with making available resources, with helping each other adapt to new styles of teaching and learning, and for overcoming the detached and the individuated experience that online education had become for most of us. To create a community, which we attempted to in our feminism classroom, meant that there was a sense of motivation for attending that class. We looked forward to hearing what other people had to say, and it helped in making the classroom an exciting place for some of us. Now, even though the nature of our communities, campus communities, classroom communities, changed drastically from an offline to an online mode, one also realized that the physical mode was only a facilitator in creating these communities. The sense of belongingness and togetherness that comes from being in a learning community is not just restricted to physicality. Reflecting upon this while creating our monograph, we realized that in our context, the subject matter of feminism helped, as it lent itself easily to sharing experiential narratives and envisioning the classroom in a more close-knit space. But the pedagogy that we used, wherein students were active participants in the process, wherein both speaking and listening were important, and it was important to respect each other as knowledge bearers and to give each other that space to grow as knowledge bearers. It helped in creating that sense of community even in an online mode. Not only the use of this pedagogy, but actively discussing the questions of pedagogy and community, they set a sort of benchmark for us and helped us to constantly evaluate ourselves to that benchmark. The demands that the pedagogy placed on both the student and the classroom became clear to us from the very beginning. And one realized how creating communities in learning was not only a one-time effort, it required constant labor in sustaining them. These are takeaways, particularly about creating communities in learning and ways of sustaining them and adapting them to one's context that we think we can take to wherever we go next, be it an online setup or in a post-pandemic world in an offline classroom. Thank you.
Gayatri, Radhika, Anamika, Ishita, thank you so much for sharing your experiences of graduating from college during the pandemic and your reflections on the nature of your classroom, the kind of pedagogy that inspired you towards this, what seems like a transformative piece of work. And thank you for highlighting that it gave you a sense of joy and purpose to work on it. And it reminded you that you needed to bring care into your classroom interactions. There was a lot to learn from all four of you. I think we can move on to any questions or comments anyone has. You can raise your hand on Zoom and we'll come to you. Dr. Kashyap, would you have any reflections at the close of the event now, having heard everyone speak?
No, I was just hoping that, my other students from the feminism class would have something to say. Rani, Apala, anything that, Apala, Rani, would you want to say something? Rani, anything that you may want to say about your own experience?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah.
My experience with my feminism class was also very new because the pedagogy was new that ma'am has adopted for this particular course. And this course from the very beginning, even our first reading, like underlined that how the purpose of education is to bring transformation. And I have personally like experienced that, like in terms of questioning my own perspectives, like introspecting my own ideas and even sometimes critiquing my own behaviors. And all this personally helped me to transform as a good human being and also to articulate my idea as a young woman. and the very first reading like taught us that how like there are several boundaries which will like try to tie you, which will try to hinder your paths, but you need to like carve out several ways how to transgress those boundaries. And the very first reading of Bell Hook, like which ma'am gave us, was something was eye-opening for all of us. And the very introductory chapter like talks about the Paulo Ferrari's statement that how like in the present structure in which we are living in is about like is something about the banking system. Like education is treated as kind of a banking system, and where we are just investing, and in terms of that we are just want some output in terms of benefit or in terms of money. But exactly education is not that, it is something beyond that. And we and how while being a feminist or reading about the feminism, you need to acknowledge this fact that how your articulation capabilities have that potential to bring changes and transformation. So this is what like my reflections from that particular class comes. Thank you.
And I just had actually a question for everyone, whoever would want to answer, because that's the sense I get. And I think Anjali made a very specific statement about, I mean, which is essentially that I think it's a tribute to human resilience that, we find ourselves in difficult situations, and we learn how to adapt and make the most of it and see the silver lining. But one of the questions that has, been bothering me is this online work, uh, and not just online teaching, but women now working from home. And when Anjali says that the mother was now, the mother of those 3 kids or 1 kid was available to her from 11 p.m. to 3 p.m., which would not have been possible in a non-pandemic, non-lockdown situation, also made me wonder, when does that particular woman sleep? Isn't this another context in which a woman is feeling compelled to be that superwoman, that this is what she will be doing? So to say that that she's now available from 11 to 3 a.m. in the morning could also mean that are women really now controlling their time, or is it really being taken away? Because I don't think domestic chores are receding, but now, and I think that the professional, in that sense, not necessarily the personal, the private, but the professional as in the external, in the form of, whether the market or work, and the domestic have taken over. So I think there is a shrinking of a woman's own space. So that is my question to all of you. I think Apala has a question too.
Hi everyone. So I'm Apala and I'm one of Reena Ma'am's students, and I was part of this feminism class as well. So just to like complicate what Ma'am said a little bit more, I think one example that we had from our own class of like a woman having to go above and beyond in terms of like the time and the efforts they put in is, I remember this one classmate of ours who wasn't really attending or wasn't really attentive in class for like one particular class. And when Reena Ma'am asked them like why they weren't that responsive in class or whatever, the student said that they were actually in the kitchen at that time making rotis, and they were trying to attend the class at the same time. And I think that that is one thing that really stayed with me for a long time in terms of how that class complicated the way I view how we've had to reimagine ourselves as students. And I think another reflection that I had, at least from my feminism classes, is I felt something that I never felt engaging in education before. I felt a sense of immense guilt because every hour that I spent at the laptop studying or attending classes was an hour where my mom, who's a working woman, would have to deal with the household chores on her own. So I felt a sense of guilt, of not being able to chip in, of not being able to do as much as I could to make that burden of having to handle all her research. She's a scientist, so all her research and all the housework at the same time. But before I pass on the mic, I'd just like to say that as like a student in LSR and studying political science, I've been studying feminism for a long time, but it's only in Reena ma'am's feminism class this year that I had the experience of what a feminist classroom looks like. And I think that's an experience that's changed me forever, because, and this is something I've communicated to ma'am later, and it's something I've communicated to the people who have been part of the monograph, that the entire notion that the things we share and the things we talk about in terms of our narratives or stories could be treated with so much dignity and so much respect and so much care, honestly, that you don't feel alienated and you feel affirmed by the people you're telling your stories to, and that these stories can be mediated through theory to become so much more than just one person's experience, but rather something that other people can relate to, other people can learn from, other people can contribute to, was my largest takeaway from class. And for that, I've got to thank ma'am, of course, but mostly all of my classmates and all the things that they shared with me. So thank you for that.
And Meenakshi, if I could just add to something that I was, one of the dangers that I see of this, whole celebration of how, we've managed to make the most of the online, which I would say it's something that we all needed to do, we all need to do if this is the only option available to us. But what I also see a danger over here really is that because we are going to be so successful in our online venture, this would then become an excuse, particularly to keep women now in the private, because this is from where they can function. Because for me, I mean, for all of us as women, the public is so important. The access to public is what feminism fought for, our access to the public, our ability to be able to cross over to the political. And the act of the political, as we all know as women, is also the fact that I can, take the metro to college, to, to school, the strangers that I meet, the conversations that I encounter, the serendipities which await me in the metro or as I walk to my place of work or college, I think those may just get denied to us. So that is looking at, the future. So this is something that we'll have to be very, very careful and conscious of, is that, yes, we'll make the most of this online, but in this celebration, let us also not say that women are now going to be out here, because I see that as a potential danger. That's all.
Diksha, if you would like to respond to Dr. Kashyap's initial question, because I think you were the one who spoke about strange times to be able to access interviewees.
I think let's just take this last question and then we can seek responses.
Yes. Sorry, it wasn't Anjali, it was Diksha. Yeah, sorry, it wasn't Anjali.
Thank you, Diksha, and thank you for those really wonderful presentations with very diverse perspectives. And I was struck by the presentations, the similarity and the difference, both in the presentation of Anjali and Reena, who are both educators and teach very different courses. I mean, looking at it from outside, Reena, you teach a more theoretical kind of a course on feminism, whereas Anjali is teaching a more hands-on kind of very creative, as one would conventionally understand. But I was struck by the similarity in how both of you brought, the creative aspect into your pedagogy and classroom. My question really was, and I don't know if there isn't enough time, was that while there would, as mentors and as teachers, be that feeling that you need to reach out to all of your students who are struggling in these difficult times, I'm sure there must have been occasions when you were not able to do that. I mean, Anjali, you shared the example of your student who was struggling with the, your students who were struggling with what they call their dark side, and or their critical, too much overtly being critical of the self. How did you deal with, on occasions when you were not able to help your students? Because otherwise we generally have our peer supporters, who we are able to meet on campus to help each other out when such instances arise. At least you have an opportunity to share. So I just wanted to learn from both of you as to how you dealt with that and whether you felt pressured because of the situation that the pandemic had thrown. Thank you. Sorry for being so long-winded.
I think we can do quick responses to this, and then we can continue the conversations on login gender itself, because that's what login gender is envisioned as, a space to have continuing conversations. So Dr. Kashyap, Anjali, Diksha, if you'd like to do quick responses.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, just a quick, Seema, I don't really have an answer, though I do know that, I can share that not in my feminism class, but in my another class, CTPB class, when I was supervising some students, and how, one of them just ended up apologizing for not being in class because she had lost her grandfather, and what it had, meant in terms of, the trauma, anxiety that everybody at home was going through, and the whole experience of the grandfather's body lying on the pavement in Banaras. The kind of thing that you read now in papers. So, so we did nothing but, for 2 hours, talk about that experience. So, these are things that have happened, but I think what you're raising is a larger question of what really is the role of a teacher. I remember when I just joined LSR, which was like several years ago, decades ago, there was this particular debate that we had in our department meeting. So one young feminist, actually a feminist-oriented teacher, had said that I don't know what you're expecting out of these tutorials. The tutorial that we have is a space where we discuss the course, where we discuss the readings. Don't expect us to be psychiatrists and psychologists. We are not trained to be that. So a tutorial is not a space where I'll be discussing a student's personal problem. Don't even go there. And this is not what I'm equipped to. And then on the other hand, there were these older faculty members who were about to retire, who had a very different view. But I think the irony is that the one who opposed the tutorial as a space for discussions other than your readings and course was a feminist-oriented teacher. So, I mean, for me, the jury is really out there. And yes, I struggle with it all the time as to how do you really negotiate that aspect. So that's that I would have to say. Anjali.
Yeah, I also wanted to add that in a similar way, I'm not, obviously don't feel equipped to deal with a lot of things that students will come back with, come and want to talk about. But there are a couple of things. Sometimes young people have had no one to talk to about things that they have faced in their childhood or even in college. So I think that if they approach me and they want to talk about it, what I feel I can provide room for is to be a listener. And if I have suggested gently therapy to a couple of people, or directed them towards thinking about that. Unfortunately, my university did not have a psychologist on board, which I think that a lot of universities still don't. I'm not sure about Delhi University actually. So I feel like counselors and psychologists are very important for the staff, whether it's schools and colleges. The pandemic has also made me reflect deeply on whether it's natural to have 10,000 students at the same place and what that does, especially to introverted students. So for example, there was a mention of women who may not, Ms. Kashyap mentioned this, women who are not, who may, and a very, very valid worry. I think that women may be expected to work from home and study from home after this. But in the same way, introverts may actually, or very shy, quiet people may actually do well in a more, less chaotic, less entropy sort of an environment. So I have often found myself thinking about schools and colleges from that perspective also. How natural are they, and how can we make them more natural to our needs as human beings? But apart from that, I think that was a really nice question from you, Seema ma'am. Very difficult to navigate that space, but so I've also worked. I also do some journalism, and I've often had I have done interviews with survivors of sexual abuse or intense trauma, and I have learned that what I can really do is just be an empathetic listener, listen very deeply, and so many times it's very possible to sympathize. I often tear up also, and I think the only thing I really can do at that moment is to listen deeply. And if I feel that the student would be comfortable, I would suggest maybe seeking therapy or talking to a professional. Beyond that, I was working towards talking to more senior faculty, because I'm very new to this, about bringing full-time psychologists into the staff, so that we could always have students be direct to them about more like about challenging things and so on. And the only thing is that I often encounter that young people have not had someone whom they can talk to about these things. So sometimes to be the first listener is, I feel, if I can do that, I feel okay, I would want to do that. So that's how I approach it.
Thank you. Rashi, you had something you'd wanted to share.
Yeah, this is in continuation to Seema ma'am's question and what Reena ma'am had answered. So I'll share my own experience. Like, you asked from a teacher's perspective how she or he should address the student under such circumstances. So I lost my uncle due to this COVID 2 months back. And it was, we were in a bad mental state. So, I just want to thank my supervisor for the time. And, like every day he would just call me and just to check up on me and my family members. It used to be like a comforting, it just had me in a quiet and a calm mental place, knowing that it's okay, things are going to be okay. There's somebody who's telling me that things are going to be okay, things are going to be fine. Because when things like that happen at home, everybody's shattered. There's not even a single person to tell you that things will turn out to be fine. But when your supervisor's talking to you and, on an everyday basis, he's telling you something or the other to motivate you and to bring you back to like normal life, that's a big deal. Like, I did not expect a supervisor to take that in charge of the student and, to act in such a way where we can just adjust in a way that certain things happen in life in certain manner, but if there's somebody who's supporting you, that's more than enough for you to get through even difficult times. So any mentor, any teacher, just a little concern to your student and just a little extra edge towards your student is more than enough a student can ask for. Just this much I wanted to add in here. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Rashi. Dr. Gopinath, would you like to share your thoughts on this evening with us?
Good evening, everyone. I've just been so struck by the wisdom and the sensitivity around this table. I mean, really, at your age, I would have neither the nuance, nor the perspective, nor the language, nor the sheer, shall I say, the self-confidence to articulate such a range of concerns and predicaments and bring them all to such a beautiful, I would say, a crescendo. And so my real takeaway from this discussion is that we are really talking about young people, both faculty and students, and you're all very young from where I sit, negotiating the dyad of resilience and fragility and vulnerability. I think that is what this whole conversation is really about, and how the classroom can be a healing space, a safe space, and how a feminist classroom is something that every classroom should aspire to be. And the other takeaway from what you have all shared so candidly, so openly, so beautifully, is that building solidarities, looking at building community, reinforcing collaborative vocabularies, moving beyond competitiveness to collaboration. These are all the new skills, if you want to call them that we would need to reinforce or reclaim for ourselves as we move ahead into an era of increasing disruption, increasing uncertainties. So I really want to thank you really for these amazing insights. And you know, what can I say? Each one of you has contributed so much to our understanding, making us think about our own certitudes, making us think about what we did not do in our roles as teachers. And so the one big takeaway again would be that this pandemic experience, especially the classroom experience, is sort of urging us to reconfigure our understanding of our role, of what knowledge is about, how knowledge is constructed, how knowledge is shared, our roles as teachers, our roles as students, our roles as co-learners, and indeed reconfiguring the space where we engage in what is called education. So I really want to thank each one of you, Anjali, Diksha, Ayushi, Rashi, Iram, wonderful to have you here from Karachi. And of course, the monograph quad. The quad is very much in vogue these days. People are talking about it in foreign policy quarters. So Anamika, Gayatri, Ishita, and Radhika. And of course, our intrepid team of Meenakshi Nair and Diksha Pudar, without whom none of this would have been possible. But really, I would say the centerpiece was held by this amazing teacher who taught feminist theory in an amazing space and is attempting to expand borders and boundaries. Reena Kashyap, salute you today, and wonderful to hear all of you. It's been a great symphony. Thank you very much. And Meenakshi, I'm sure you and Diksha will carry this conversation, have more people on Log in Gender, or what we call Log in Gender, and take it to even greater heights. Thank you for a fabulous evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I'd just like to thank everyone for spending this evening with us. I'd like to thank our speakers. As Dr. Gopinath has already said, it was wonderful listening to all of you. Anjali, Diksha, Ayushi, Rashi, Iram, your experiences are so distinct, but there's so much to take away from it. And Anamika, Gayatri, Ishita, Radhika, your work is truly very exciting, and the way you've created a community and your focus on the community of the classroom has been really amazing to learn about. Thank you, Dr. Gopinath, for providing us Log in Gender as a space to have these conversations. Thank you, Ms. Kakran. Thank you, Mr. Mehrotra, for always guiding Log in Gender. And we hope to have more such conversations, and we hope to take this conversation further on Login Gender. So please do visit it to see the reflections that have been pouring in since Friday on the first part of this gender log. And there is a lot to learn and engage with and reflect on. So thank you once again, and good night.